After months of relative calm, relations between the United States and China have once again entered a phase of acute confrontation. The trigger was the new sanctions imposed by Donald Trump's administration against the Russian oil giants Lukoil and Rosneft. This decision became Washington's toughest move against Moscow since the start of the war in Ukraine in the year 2022. However, beyond Russia, these sanctions immediately turned into a global problem, since the main buyer of Russian oil is China. And now it is Beijing that faces a complex dilemma, on which depends not only the fate of the Russian economy, but also the stability of the entire global energy system. According to Reuters, the White House discussed this sanctions package for several weeks with the participation of officials from the Treasury Department, the State Department, and the Pentagon. As Politico reported, citing sources within the administration, Trump personally insisted that the measures include a ban on transactions with Rosneft and Lukoil subsidiaries operating outside Russia. This effectively means that any company purchasing oil from these entities risks falling under U.S. secondary sanctions. The impact extends not only to Russian banks and carriers, but also to Chinese oil corporations, including Sinopec and CNPC. This was a blow not only to Russia, but also to China, noted Michael Hudson, an analyst at the Institute of International Relations in Washington. According to him, it was Beijing that became the main driver of stability in Russian oil trade after 2022. Over these years, China nearly doubled its imports of Russian oil, securing both a strategic advantage, cheap raw materials, and political leverage over Moscow. Now, the United States has decided to strike precisely at that link. As Bloomberg sources report, Beijing perceived these sanctions as a direct threat to its energy security. The Chinese economy consumes colossal volumes of hydrocarbons, more than 15 million barrels of oil per day, and a significant share of those supplies come from Russia. Any disruptions or restrictions could trigger an internal crisis and a spike in fuel prices, which is particularly dangerous amid an economic slowdown and a recent decline in industrial output. According to sources in China's National Development and Reform Commission, Xi Jinping personally held a meeting with the heads of major state oil companies, demanding a detailed analysis of the consequences of the new American measures. Insiders say that during the meeting, two scenarios were discussed. The first, a temporary reduction in Russian oil imports to demonstrate flexibility ahead of a possible meeting with Trump. The second, a complete refusal to comply with sanctions and the continuation of purchases through alternative channels, using intermediary companies in Southeast Asia. Yet this very dilemma makes Beijing's position extremely difficult. On one hand lies economic logic. Russian oil is cheap and strategically advantageous. On the other hand lies political risk. Defying sanctions could result in secondary U.S. measures, including asset freezes and restrictions on dollar settlements. For China, which still depends on the international financial system, that would strike at the foundation of its foreign trade. The Wall Street Journal, citing sources in the White House, reported that Trump is considering expanding sanctions if China consciously continues to buy from Russia. "We have made it clear that any companies helping Russia circumvent sanctions will be punished," said National Security Advisor Marco Rubio. In Beijing, this statement was perceived as an ultimatum. Against this backdrop, Chinese state media began sharply shifting their tone. The Global Times, which usually reflects the position of the Communist Party, published an editorial titled, "China Will Not Act Under U.S. Dictation." The article stated that Washington is trying to use sanctions as a weapon of economic pressure and that China is ready to defend its interests by any means. However, just a few days later, the publication removed part of the materials, which, according to experts, may indicate an attempt to soften the tone ahead of the upcoming summit between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping. According to CNN, the summit is expected to take place in Singapore, a neutral venue where both sides will be able to discuss tariff issues as well as energy deals. Sources within the administration say that China's future position will depend on the outcome of these talks. If Trump agrees to partially lift tariffs in exchange for reducing China's imports of Russian oil, the parties may announce mutual understanding. But if the meeting ends in failure, the world may find itself on the verge of a new trade war, potentially larger than that of 2018 to 2020. Analysts from the Brookings Institution warn that if China opts for confrontation, Washington will respond not only with economic, but also technological measures, export restrictions on microchips, sanctions against Chinese banks, and even limits on access to the SWIFT system. Beijing understands this. Behind the scenes, Chinese diplomacy is actively engaging with India, Saudi Arabia, and BRICS countries, seeking to establish parallel channels for oil trade in yuan. According to leaks from the Trivium China think tank, Xi Jinping has already instructed major state-owned enterprises to temporarily suspend signing new contracts with Rosneft until negotiations with the United States are concluded. This step is seen as temporary but symbolic. Beijing wants to buy time and avoid sharp moves before the leaders' face-to-face meeting. Meanwhile, concern is growing in Russia. As reported by Kommersant, the Kremlin had expected China to take a firm stance and continue purchases despite US pressure. But now, with Beijing starting to review contracts, Moscow risks losing its largest buyer. Russia's Ministry of Finance has already acknowledged that if China cuts imports by even 30%, the budget could lose more than $40 billion annually. For the Russian economy, where oil revenues make up about 1/3 of the budget, this would be catastrophic. According to Nikkei Asia, Japan and South Korea are closely monitoring the situation. If China actually reduces its purchases from Russia, part of the volumes could be redirected to the Asian market, crashing prices and putting additional pressure on the region's energy sector. At the same time, Beijing is preparing for the worst. According to the Financial Times, China is purchasing record volumes of oil from Iran, Malaysia, and Indonesia to build strategic reserves in case of a sanctions crisis. IMF economists warn that if the sanctions conflict drags on, global oil prices could jump to $80 to $90 per barrel and accelerate a shift by major economies toward energy protectionism. The United States is already considering a full ban on the import of petroleum products produced with Russian oil components, regardless of country of origin, which could trigger a global chain reaction. On the diplomatic front, tensions are escalating. The US State Department has officially demanded that China stop supporting the Russian oil industry. In response, China's foreign ministry stated that energy supply decisions are part of each country's sovereign rights. And while both sides publicly express willingness for dialogue, behind the scenes, true economic blackmail is underway. American media report that in the coming weeks, a US congressional delegation plans to visit Taiwan, which could further provoke Beijing. In Chinese military circles, this is viewed as a test of endurance. And if the diplomatic crisis coincides with the energy one, the consequences could be unpredictable. According to Stratfor, Pentagon analysts are already modeling scenarios of economic confrontation with military elements. The idea is simple. If China violates sanctions and continues financing Russia through oil purchases, the United States could restrict Chinese vessels' access to American ports and block dollar transactions of China's state banks. This will lead to global financial turbulence, hitting world trade. As markets react nervously to every statement, the fate of the world economy now depends on the outcome of the meeting between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping. Their talks could either stabilize the planet or finally divide it into two energy blocks, the American and the Chinese. While some see Trump's move as a strategic blitzkrieg, others view it as the beginning of a new Cold War, in which oil will become the main weapon of the 21st century. And as sources at the Rand Corporation note, if this meeting ends in failure, the consequences for the world will be far more serious than they appear today.